As with any episode of Beards and Cars wherein I talk about a classic, the parameters of how I discuss this vehicle just have to be different, because with most reviews it's about giving you the information to go out and buy a car that you might have been thinking about. Well, chances are you're probably not going to go down the road in the vague hope, especially here in the UK, that there might be a Lincoln for sale at your local used dealer. There isn't, and unless you're specifically looking for one, I'm going to assume that most people watching the video are probably interested in knowing more about this car. If you know that this is mine, which it is, you're probably curious why I chose to buy it, why this car, why not something like a Cadillac, why not a more obvious choice, maybe even why not an actual muscle car rather than a luxury car. Well, we're going to get into those, and we're also going to discuss the 4 primary questions that I get asked the most, so let's get those out of the way first. Question number 1, here in the UK, what miles per gallon does it get? It's always the question that everyone jokes about, so let's answer it. 7.5, and on the motorway, 12. So in other words, it costs me about £1 a mile to run this car at the moment, which if it sounds expensive, really is. In comparison, my Golf R32 is 25 pence a mile, which isn't necessarily cheap, but looks like a Prius compared to this. Especially when you have to also add to this car Red X LED replacement as well, because it hasn't had any modifications, so all in all you're looking at around the £200 mark to fill the 97 litre tank. I've got to say though, it's worth every penny. I adore this car. It's my favourite car I've ever had, and I drive it as much as I can, because I absolutely love this car. Now the reason why I love it, and this is actually a theory which I've had for some time, and this car has proven it to be true many times over. In my opinion, a classic just has a certain aura to it, which modern cars just don't. They have a charm. They have something which, again, new cars don't have, and that is a story. Cars don't have stories anymore. They're just a commodity, as good as they are, that just gets passed from person to person. A classic has been places, seen things, it has DNA in it. Probably in more ways than one. It's a car that is storied, and this is no exception. This car started its life at, I believe it was called Rockport, around 90 miles away from Chicago. It was owned by someone in the sheriff's department. It came to the UK in 2013 after probably, if the mileage on the car is accurate at least, being garaged for quite some time. Certainly it's been taken care of, given the weather in that part of the US being not that much better than England most of the time, and then it came here in 2013. It was owned by a guy who had never even had an automatic car before, so I'm actually shocked that this thing has survived for the past decade or so, but I'm glad that it did, and it was even featured as a cover car in a classic American magazine relatively recently, not too long before I bought it in fact. So it's a car that's already been places, it's famous to a degree, and it's a car that has been to different continents, different countries. It's just intriguing immediately as soon as you see it. The next question that I always get asked is, how do you park that thing? Well, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I just use the steering wheel, like everyone else. It's actually not that difficult to park. See, this car is 80 inches wide, which is 7 foot, or 7'6", 6'7" even. So it's actually not that crazy. Ironically, it's actually a little bit narrower than the Flying Spur that I had. That is a wider car than this, especially at the mirrors. The main way in which this is very big, though, is the length. It's not overly tall. In fact, it's actually shorter than my Golf, as crazy as it sounds. The width is wide, but not insanely wide. It fits snugly within a British parking space. It's the length that really is crazy. It's 18'4" long, which is over a foot longer than the aforementioned Bentley, which I had before, a couple of cars ago, which itself was pretty much a limo, so this really is massive. One of the reasons for that, though, is construction differences between now and then. And to cut a long story short, most cars from this era tended to go round or down kind of a notchback route, wherein the boot was an addition to the car rather than fitting inside the car. Like modern cars, the boot kind of goes in under the seats almost, like a TARDIS. Whereas old cars, they just added the boot on the back, or the trunk in this case. Likewise with the engine, you'll see engines being fitted quite far back nowadays. This one isn't. It perfectly fills that massive bonnet, and everything about the car is massive. Of course, the engine is massive, and incidentally, you can actually tell that this was an early to mid 1968 model because of the fact that it has that 462 engine. Now, the 462 is, of course, the cubic inches. very big engine. In British money, that's a 7.6 litre or a 7600cc or thereabouts. It is, of course, a V8 carburettor, in this case a Carter carburettor. And interestingly, the late 1968 cars within that same year went from a 462 to a 460. So a smaller engine, from a 7.6 to a 7.5, but power went up from 340 in the case of mine to 365. And also they improved the emissions as well. So those smaller engines in the later part of the year you could say are superior, but personally I'm glad I got this one, because if you're going to have a huge engine, you may as well have the hugest. So in the case of this car, 340 horses, and funnily enough the Bentley just keeps on poking its nose in, but this has the same torque output as a Flying Spur. To me, that's actually kind of the craziest thing, because that Bentley is a high-performance twin-turbo 6-litre W12. This is a 55-year-old carburettor V8, and it puts out the same amount of torque. 485 pound-feet, which is 660 newton-meters, and that's, unsurprisingly, at only 2800 RPM. Peak power is only 4600 RPM, so it is essentially a tugboat of an engine. And in the case of mine, with a straight pipe, or a pair of them in this case, it sounds absolutely phenomenal. In fact, the sound is most people's favourite thing about the car, and it tends to be the first thing that they notice, given that you can hear it from quite a way away, regardless of if it's in front of you or behind you. Now the next question is, what's it like to drive? This is kind of a two-part question. First of all, what's it like to drive, period, but then more specifically, most people ask that, and what they really mean is, what's it like to drive it in the UK? Our roads are much smaller, you're driving on the left in a left-hand drive car, surely that's got to be weird. I've never even owned a left-hand drive car before. That's all true. I've only driven one left-hand drive car before this one, a Dodge Ram. I reviewed it, of course, here on the channel, and I've got to say, it's been totally fine. In fact, as weird as it sounds, I think I might actually prefer left-hand drive now over right-hand drive, even in England. There's just something about it which I like. I love driving left-hand drive, and there's just a charm to it. Now, in terms of what it's like to drive overall, that is the part that will surprise most people. Because even though I don't let anyone else drive the car, if they were to drive it, I think they would be surprised. Because of two things. One, this does not handle like a boat. In fact, it has self-leveling suspension, amongst other things, and it also stops on a dime compared to what you would think, because it has disc brakes on the front, as standard from the factory in the 60s. This was a very advanced car for its time. Now, unsurprisingly, it does have drums on the back, but those discs on the front are such a lifesaver, potentially literally in some cases, because it stops and goes as well as most modern cars. Now, technically the 0 to 60 time is supposed to be something like 8.5–9 seconds, but really who cares? You don't buy a car like this for performance, and if you were, you should just buy a muscle car instead. Is it comfortable? Hell yeah, it's comfortable. It has 6-way electronic seats, of course a bench in the front and the back, which has a number of beneficial uses, and it allows you to seat 6 people. Which is also technically the most seats I've ever had in a car, even having had a Touareg, which is another crazy thing to think about. Now, speaking to the boot space, briefly, or the trunk space, I guess I should say, the trunk is huge on this car, and the trunk is actually longer than the bonnet. Incidentally, I love that. I really love classic American cars that have a longer back end than a front end. I think it looks really classy, whereas then, like in the 70s, it tended to swap around the other way, and I'm not as much of a fan of that. However, the trunk space is interesting in this car because they kind of took, well, they came first, so technically not, but it has kind of a Jag XK approach to trunk space, wherein the boot is very long and very wide, but not as deep as you might expect. And the reason why is because the car itself isn't that thick. From bottom to top, it's quite a modestly sized car. It's almost squat in its appearance. There's still more than enough headroom, don't get me wrong, but it's a lot lower than you'd think, even without lowered suspension. The boot space, though, is phenomenal. In terms of actual size, it's 18 cubic feet. So in European terms, litres, although I'm not sure who really ever talks about their boot space in litres, to compare it to something like the Bentley, yet again, the Bentley had 475 litres of boot space, and that was a big boot. You could get like 5 hookers in that boot. This boot, you could probably get about 8 hookers in there, because this boot is 510 litres, more than enough for pretty much anything, and it even has a full-size spare tyre instead of a little can of foam like a modern car might have, or a Space Saver. Now, in terms of this car in its day, well, it was remarkable because, I mean, even taking on Cadillac, which is exactly what this was intended to do, to directly compete with the Cadillac DeVille, the premier American car, it was the Rolls-Royce of its time, this was the Bentley, the slight second place nipping at its heels. This went about it in a very clever way. Everything that Cadillac has an option for, this had as standard. That's a good way of doing it, but it also means the car is expensive. Now, I will say, they did get results. They couldn't quite match the sales of Cadillac, which, let's be honest, they didn't have a long time to do so, so it was a catching up game. But there were a ton of Cadillac owners who bought one of these instead of another Cadillac. And in fact, this car was such a success that it kind of hurt sales, because it was so good that people didn't need to buy another one. In fact, they did some surveys back in the 60s wherein, looking through luxury car owners, how many of them actually kept the car after, the first year. This, in its early production run, was in the high 60% region of retainers, owners keeping it after the first year. By this point in production, it was up to 90%. That's awful for sales, because it means people aren't buying new ones, but it's great in terms of speaking to how well made the car was. Now, another crazy thing about this car's history is how these engines were kind of provided, really, because it's called an MEL engine, Mercury, Edsel, Lincoln. Those were the 3 applications, and being a 462, those extra 2 inches were bored and stroked out from the 460, the existing 7.5 litre. Those engines, though, were actually used after being quote-unquote found in a warehouse. Of course, one of Ford Lincoln's warehouses. 30,000 of these 462 engines were just in a warehouse, tested and ready to go. Now, it's not exactly known, at least from what I could find, why there were 30,000 of these engines in a warehouse, but they sure made good use of them. It's possible that somebody produced them and wrote in a wrong number and had too many, then tried to cover up their mistake, but whatever the case, it certainly wasn't a bad thing, because they sold over 40,000 of these generation of cars, and of all of those, this particular model that I've got, which is an early 1968 462 Coupe, the 2-door, these are only in around the 9,000 region in terms of production. So by American standards, at least non-performance car standards, it's fairly rare. Now, some of the other things which also came into effect in the 1968 year were things like the Lincoln Cross, or the Lincoln Star, depending on what you want to call it. The hood ornament on previous models was removed for this year due to safety concerns. Personally, I'm actually happy about that. I think that hood ornaments are sometimes a little bit garish, and I prefer the car without it, so I think that's great. 1968, of course, was also a massively important year for Lincoln, because within that year, they actually celebrated producing their 1 millionth car. Mine isn't that car, but yeah, they produced their millionth car in that year. This car in this year also had the FM radio adapter come into play. Ooh, the futures are coming, boyos. And some people did not go for that. In fact, there's a really nice companion piece. If you do enjoy this review and want to hear more about the car, I would recommend going to the link in the description below, which is to Jay Leno's Garage, wherein they talk about a slightly different model of the same shape, the 4-door convertible, with a really knowledgeable guy there, wherein they talk about some of those optional extras and real amazing innovation of the time. This car is full of relays and switches and electronics, making it potentially a pain in the ass if it does break, but a pain in the ass in 1968 standards is still simpler than most modern cars. One of the things that I really enjoyed finding out about this car while I looked through the very impressively sized maintenance manual, which I'm very grateful came with it, was that it had auto-dimming headlights. It almost looks like an old-fashioned camera, like those cameras that look like a bag full of steps or bricks. These are located within the body, and they're photosensitive, so that when the main beam lights of an oncoming car fall on the lens, it automatically dips your headlights so that you don't have to do it. In 1968, It was outlawed at around the same time because the driver didn't have control over the system and it was doing it for you. I find it kind of odd that they don't find cruise control unsafe, given that that's far more of a lack of driver control than auto-dimming headlights, but hey, whatever. The car also had, and I believe I may have mentioned this earlier on, auto-leveling suspension as well. These cars were extremely advanced for their time. Stuff like all-round electric windows, the small rear quarters, the front windows, even in the case of this coupe, they're all electric, as standard, no optional extra. 6-way seats, the entire bench can move, the back support. This is the kind of stuff you'd expect on a car now, not necessarily back then, but it's so impressive. It has 2 buttons, and these buttons' only purpose is to raise and lower the radio antenna. It's just such a perfect encapsulation of America at its best. I didn't go out of my way to try and find a Lincoln Continental because I didn't even know that one may be in my potential price range. Most Continentals, most classics have gone crazy in price, so even finding one at all in England was a big deal. I absolutely adore this car. I'm doing small things to it here and there all the time currently, at least at the time of releasing this video. I'm actually working on the electric window motor, removing the glass. I'm already 98% done on that, to put a new motor in and get it working again on the passenger side. Driver's side still works, rear quarter still works, as does most everything else on the car. And even though it's road tax exempt, MOT exempt, and has the cheapest insurance of any car I've ever owned, by about 4 figures, it's still a car which gives you so much joy. It doesn't have the performance, it doesn't have the modern, advances in, you could say, construction, whatever. It's just a car that hits different. Classics just do. You pull up in something like a Ferrari, people are going to assume a certain thing about you. You're a crypto bro, you're a trust fund kid, you're whatever. You pull up in a classic, it doesn't matter what it is, from a Mini to a Cadillac, everyone loves it. I've driven this car simultaneously out on the same day to just pop out and get some eggs, as you do, and I drove past a bunch of Asbo-looking teens in hoodies. They shouted, "Rev it, mate," which of course I did, and they loved it. A few hundred yards down the road I pulled into a shop, Asda, and then 4 70, 80-year-old folks had stopped just to point at the car and gawk at it. It's a car which everyone from 5 to 85 and everything in between can love, because it's not a car that's about a clique, it's not about a fandom, it's not a JDM car, it's not this car, it's not a muscle car, it's just a piece of art with a steering wheel. And that is what brings me so much joy, because it brings everyone who sees it so much joy. To the point where the other day, I literally had a completely random stranger knock on my door and ask if I'd be willing to use it as their wedding car. It's just a car that starts conversations, and everyone loves a classic. To me, I don't regret buying this car at all. I absolutely adore it, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. But if you haven't already, be sure to check out that episode of Jay Leno's Garage as well, which is almost an hour long. They get super in-depth into it. And until next time, I'll see you then with more. And of course, if you want to check out my other classic reviews, click here on screen to the Beards and Cars series. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.